Have you ever stopped to consider how often your opinions feel like your own, yet sometimes feel like they arrive fully formed? How cultural shifts can move through society almost overnight. How language changes, norms change, acceptable thought changes, and most people simply adjust. For the past several weeks, I've been deep in research on social engineering, not the cybercrime definition, not phishing emails or password scams. I'm talking about behavioural influence at scale, group psychology, narrative shaping, institutional research into how humans behave in collectives. What essentially began as curiosity about modern persuasion led me back to post-war Britain, to a name that appears repeatedly in discussions about social psychology and institutional influence, and that is the Tavistock Institute. Some describe it as a pioneering centre of organisational psychology. Others claim it played a far greater role in shaping modern culture. So I asked a simple question: where does documented history end and interpretation begin? And more importantly, when did social engineering stop being experimental and start becoming normal? You're listening to the Luminary Room, and I'm your host, Nico, the voice behind 369 Lumineer. This is episode 25, When Social Engineering Went Mainstream, the Tavistock Institute question. So what is the Tavistock Institute? Well, the story begins in the early 20th century, rooted in psychiatry and trauma treatment following the First World War. By World War II, British military psychiatrists were studying morale, group cohesion, and psychological resilience among soldiers. And out of that environment emerged what later became known as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in 1947. Its focus was organisational psychology, group dynamics, systems theory, how institutions function, how leadership affects morale, how collective behaviour shifts under stress. That much is documented. Researchers associated with Tavistock explored how individuals behave differently in groups, how authority shapes compliance, how emotional undercurrents influence workplace productivity. Now, none of that sounds sinister, right? In fact, many of those studies helped corporations understand employee well-being and helped institutions rethink rigid hierarchies. But here's where the conversation becomes a little more interesting. Because once you understand how groups behave, once you understand how authority interacts with identity, and once you understand how fear, uncertainty, and belonging shape decisions, you're no longer just studying human behaviour. You're holding a blueprint. Now think about that. If you can map the psychology of a group, what stops you from influencing it? And if large institutions fund and apply that research, how does it shape culture over time? I can tell you with conviction that Tavistock researchers were involved in systems thinking that later influenced management science, corporate restructuring, and public policy frameworks. Group relations conferences became a hallmark of their work. These were designed to examine unconscious processes within organisations. Unconscious processes. That phrase matters because social engineering operates most effectively beneath conscious awareness. It doesn't demand compliance. It nudges, it reframes, it normalises. During the post-war period, Western societies experienced rapid cultural change. Mass media expanded. Advertising became more psychological. PR matured into a discipline deeply informed by behavioural science. Edward Bernays, he was the father of public relations, had already demonstrated decades earlier that public opinion could be shaped deliberately. You may have also heard the term nudge units. These are government or institutional teams that use insights from behavioural science to subtly influence people's decisions without restricting their choices. The concept comes from Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein's book Nudge, which showed how small changes in how options are presented can steer people toward unprompted, subconscious decisions for themselves or society. For example, supermarkets don't randomly decide which products sit at eye level. Shelf space is often allocated to higher margin or high profit items because what we see first, we are more likely to choose. End of aisle displays checkout placements, and product positioning are designed to influence behaviour without us consciously registering the design. Now, the same principle applies elsewhere. Employees are automatically enrolled into retirement plans. Reminder messages for tax payments or vaccinations may emphasise what most people are already doing, subtly reinforcing social norms. Now, none of these remove choice, but they do structure the environment in a way that guides it. And this is where the connection becomes clear. What began as research into group behaviour and decision-making now informs how both markets and governments shape outcomes at scale. The difference today is not whether behavioural science is used, but how openly it's institutionalised. In many countries, governments now operate dedicated behavioural units, often called behavioural insight teams, applying psychology, economics and social research directly to public policy. So ask yourself this: was Tavistock part of that broader intellectual ecosystem, or simply adjacent to it? Now, the Institute collaborated with corporations and governments on organisational change projects. It contributed to research on workplace democracy and socio-technical systems, and those models influenced how companies structured teams and adopted technology. And that's all traceable. Once behavioural science enters governance, it rarely stays neutral, because when you apply systems thinking to society itself, you begin to view populations as variables, as inputs and outputs, as problems to be optimised. Look at modern language, behavioural insights teams, nudge units, strategic communications, psychological operations, or PSYOPs as we now refer to them. These terms are no longer fringe, they're institutional. Governments openly employ behavioural scientists to influence public compliance on issues ranging from health to taxation. So, is that inherently wrong, or is it simply applied psychology? Well, the question depends on transparency, on consent, and on awareness. The Tavistock Institute has publicly described its mission as advancing understanding of human systems to improve organisational life. And yet, over decades, its name appears repeatedly in alternative discussions about cultural transformation. Several commentators suggest that cultural destabilisation, shifting social norms, and generational value disruption reflect deliberate psychological experimentation. Now consider this. After World War II, Western societies moved towards consumerism at unprecedented speed. Advertising became identity-driven. Music, film, and youth culture became vehicles of social change. Psychology departments flourished. Corporate management increasingly relied on behavioural metrics. Now, is this coincidence or convergence? Think about the 1960s, which is now seen as a decade defined by social upheaval. New attitudes towards authority, new definitions of identity, and new political alignments. Now, the 60s didn't just produce music, but reshaped the cultural landscape itself. Bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, the Grateful Dead, the Doors, and others didn't just play songs. They became defining voices of youth identity, rebellion, and social transformation. What many remember as spontaneous cultural upheaval was also a moment when popular music's emotional power reached unprecedented scale, influencing attitudes towards authority, sexuality, and individual freedom. Music wasn't just entertainment. It became a shared language for a generation questioning established norms and embracing new ways of seeing the world. This explosive cultural impact didn't occur in isolation, but alongside broader transformative forces that blurred boundaries between art, psychology, and collective behaviour. One detail often cited in this debate involves Jim Morrison, the lead vocalist of The Doors. His father, George Stephen Morrison, was a US Navy Rear Admiral who operated within the upper tiers of the American military during the Vietnam War and beyond. Now, such proximity to military and intelligence environments complicates the image of The Doors as pure counterculture outsiders. It begs the question whether rebellion that passes cleanly through media systems, record labels, and international promotion is in fact rebellion at all. Now, during that same period, some researchers affiliated with systems theory and organisational psychology were studying how institutions adapt under pressure. I'll make the point that correlation is not necessarily causation, but patterns do deserve some attention. When people raise questions about Tavistock's influence on culture, critics often respond by saying there's no direct evidence of a coordinated cultural manipulation. And that may be true in terms of documented directives. But influence doesn't require a secret master plan. Ideas spread through academic networks. Concepts migrate into policy. Research informs training programs. Frameworks become best practice. And over decades, society internalises them. If you want to explore another dimension on how behavioural influence has been discussed in contemporary discourse, I encourage you to read my article, Trauma-Based Mind Control and the Manufacturing of Obedience. It examines different interpretations of psychological influence and invites readers to think critically about how obedience is shaped in cultural systems. I'll leave the link in the summary notes. Now, think about your workplace. Team building exercises, flattened hierarchies, feedback loops, conflict resolution workshops. Now, many of these structures trace back to post-war organisational psychology movements, and yes, some even influenced by Tavistock-associated research. Now, let's scale that outward, from workplace to education, from education to media, from media to governance. Where does guidance end and engineering begin? But here's the deeper issue. Modern societies increasingly operate through behavioural management rather than overt control. Compliance is achieved through narrative shaping, through repetition, through emotional priming, through perceived consensus. And social media accelerates this. Algorithms reward conformity to prevailing narratives. Dissent becomes socially costly, and people self-regulate. That's social engineering in practice, whether centralised or emergent. Now ask yourself this: does this require a single institution pulling strings, or is it the natural evolution of applied behavioural science? The Tavistock Institute represents an early node in the formalisation of group psychological research. It studied systems, it examined authority, it analysed collective behaviour. Those tools exist now across government, corporations and digital platforms. So the question is not whether Tavistock secretly controls society. The question is whether the framework it helped develop became embedded so deeply that influence feels organic. Because when influence becomes normal, you simply stop noticing. Public messaging shifts subtly. Language evolves. Certain viewpoints gain institutional backing and others fade. And most people interpret this as cultural evolution, not behavioural architecture. Now, I won't dive into it in this episode, but think about public health campaigns, climate messaging, economic narratives, security framing. In each case, behavioural compliance is the goal. Fear and hope are calibrated carefully, and data informs messaging strategies. And none of this is hidden. It's simply standard practice. So, in my opinion, the real issue is awareness. Do people understand that behavioural science shapes communication strategies directed at them? Do they recognise when narratives are designed rather than spontaneous? Now, there's a difference between persuasion and manipulation, where persuasion invites choice and manipulation obscures it. The line between the two depends on transparency and informed consent. And when institutions apply behavioural frameworks without public awareness, that line clearly blurs. Now, when some people hear the name Tavistock, they immediately assume conspiracy, where others dismiss any questioning as paranoia. But removing the extreme doesn't remove responsibility. The Tavistock Institute wasn't a passive observer of social change. It emerged as a pioneering force in the study of group psychology, organisational systems, and behavioural dynamics. Its work helped shape modern management theory and influenced how institutions understood authority, structure, and collective behaviour. Governments and corporations didn't ignore those insights, they adopted them. And ideas don't remain confined to academic papers. They move, they're funded, they're implemented, they scale. So what began as research simply didn't remain theoretical. Tavistock helped formalise frameworks for analysing how groups think how leadership directs perception, and how systems can be structured to produce consistent behavioural responses. Over time, those frameworks moved from conference rooms into operating models. They became embedded in leadership training, policy development, corporate governance, and strategic communication. The research evolved into practice, and the practice scaled. So the more honest question is not whether Tavistock is responsible for cultural manipulation in some cinematic sense. The question is this: to what extent did Tavistock's early experiments in group psychology lay the intellectual groundwork for modern behavioural governance? When behavioural science became institutionalised, when influence became structured, and when systems were designed around psychological predictability, that lineage can easily be traced, and in my opinion, tracing it matters. Because here's something worth considering. Even if Tavistock itself is simply one historical contributor among many, the mainstreaming of social engineering is undeniable. We see it in plain sight. Behavioural science now informs government, corporate policy, digital architecture, educational curricula, marketing ecosystems. The blueprint exists and it's being used. The challenge is not to uncover a secret mastermind, it's to cultivate discernment, to recognise when emotional reactions are being triggered deliberately, to question sudden consensus, to examine how narratives are framed. Who benefits from this framing? What alternative interpretations exist? What data is omitted? When you begin asking those questions, influence loses its power, because awareness interrupts automatic compliance. And that may be the most important lesson in this entire conversation. Not whether Tavistock engineered society, but whether society has normalised social engineering itself. If behavioural science can optimise productivity, it can optimise belief. If systems theory can recapture companies, it can restructure public perception. And if influence operates beneath awareness, the only safeguard is critical thought. Well, this is where I leave you. Not with certainty, not with accusation, but with inquiry. The Tavistock Institute represents a documented chapter in the development of group psychology. Its ideas move through institutions, and those institutions have shaped culture. That chain deserves examination. Because once social engineering becomes mainstream, it stops looking like engineering and it starts looking more like reality. So until next time, I encourage you to examine the narratives you consume, to trace ideas back to their intellectual roots, and to question whether the shifts you witness are organic or architected. Study the history of behavioural science. Look into the institutions that shape policy. Notice how language frames debate. Protect your autonomy, not by rejecting everything, but by thinking independently before you align with anything. Awareness is not rebellion, it's responsibility. The goal is not suspicion for its own sake, it's clarity. If social engineering has become part of modern governance and culture, then those who are informed must become students of influence. Ask who designed the message, what emotional lever it pulls, what assumption it requires you to accept, and then decide consciously. As always, stay curious, stay critical, and stay aware. This is Nico, signing off.